And now it's time to preview an upcoming game with Ryan Metzler.
Hey everyone, it's Ryan Metzler here again, and today we're going to do another Dice Tower preview. This time we're going to take a look at Wizards Academy, which is a cooperative game in which players are members of a Wizards Academy trying to resolve some type of issue going on in that academy, be it placing some guardians into particular rooms, or making sure everything is set for the inspector to come around, or working with some demons in order to try and capture their souls. So you're going to be moving around the academy trying to cast spells by collecting glyphs and using them in order to try and accomplish these objectives, all with a little bit of a memory aspect worked in. So real quick, why don't we take a look at what you'll get inside of the game? Remembering that these are prototype, not final quality components, we'll take a look at how the game plays, and then we'll come back here and I'll sum it all up for you. So here you can see the spell grid for Wizards Academy. Now this is one of two boards that's going to be used in the game, and this is going to be kind of off to the side, and it is a major portion of the game, but I wanted to discuss it before we went back and looked at the actual board in the game, because you're going to be referencing this pretty regularly when you're playing the game in order to get more information, cast spells, and oftentimes to try and figure out how you're going to solve the main objective of whatever goal you have, as determined by the Grimoire. So Wizards Academy is a cooperative game in which you are going to be trying to reach some objective. It depends on which scenario you've chosen from this grimoire. So as you flip through here, you'll actually see towards the back, we have different types of scenarios. So you can see the first one is called Golem Construction. I'll kind of hold this a little bit better. Golem Construction tells you how to set this up. So it's going to tell you what spells you need inside of this spell grid. It's going to tell you how to set up the main rooms in the actual main board of the game. But importantly, it's going to tell you how to win. So for Golem Construction, you would be trying to place a certain number of golems or guardians into particular rooms. So you want to make sure that there are golems or guardians in the four corner rooms of the main board, which we'll look at shortly. If you were doing demon binding, you're going to be trying to siphon a soul out of a demon. If you were doing the inspector calls, there's going to be some type of protocol you need to follow in order to please the inspector. And if you're doing evasive grimoire, which is this last one right here that's in the book, you're going to be trying to lock certain level 4 spells. So now let's take a look at the grid board here, or the spell grid. This spell grid is broken into different levels. So we have level 1, which is these first 3 columns. They're marked by a 1. Level 2, which is the next 2 columns, marked by a 2. And then we have level 3 and level 4, which are going to be, of course, the last and second, or the second to last and last columns, respectively. Now, in your setup, dependent on which scenario you're doing, you're going to choose specific spells. So, for example, we know from the setup that the spell Nova is somewhere in these first level 1 spells. And we know that the spell Guardian is somewhere in the last row, the 4 cards. And Guardian's going to be important for us to find because we need to put more Guardians onto the board. So without that, we won't be able to do so. Now, you're also going to be placing some additional random spells in, and you're going to be placing some bad spells in, and those bad spells are called botches. Bad spells will have kind of a red banner at the top here. So this one is called Danger. You can see that it's a level 1 spell because it's posted in the top right-hand corner. And then you can see 2 effects printed on it. So the first one says that you teleport to whichever unisolated room, just means that it's connected to the main room in the board, has the most threats. So if there's a lot of threats in one room, you will automatically be teleported there if you cast this spell. Obviously, you're going to try and avoid doing that. There's a little shield there then, and then if you have this little shield either in the room you're in or on the character you're playing, you will have the bottom effect instead. So this says, instead, you may teleport to a room of your choice that has at least 1 threat. So it's a little bit better. Having that shield helps you out some. So if you were to cast this spell, and we'll talk about how you cast spells momentarily, the bad thing would happen because it's a botched spell. Alternatively, if we look at one of the spells, a good spell here, they're going to have kind of a yellow banner. This one's called Scribe. This one will let you take an action called Binding Spells, which we'll talk about again in more detail, which is an action you would usually take when in the library on the board. So this would be a good spell to cast because it's going to let you do something out of turn. Basically, you won't have to be in the library in order to take the Bind Spells action. Now, how are you going to cast spells? Well, let's talk about that. To cast a spell in Wizards Academy, you're going to be collecting glyphs, and you'll see that this grid system is based on these different glyphs. They're basically glyphs 1 through glyph 7. So for example, if I was to collect 2 1 glyphs, and I was to cast glyph 1, I would discard those 2 glyphs using my cast spell action, and I would flip this card over if it was face down. I would then have to cast the spell. So again, this is the danger spell. I would have to cast it and do whatever the effect says. At this point, the card will flip face back down. This is an unlocked spell. Now, I can lock these later using the bind spells action, which we'll talk about, and that would flip it face up like this so that I would know what that spell is later. But more on that to come. So for example, if I were to collect a purple and a yellowish color here, I would cast this spell. And so I would cast Scribe. And then you'll see, of course, that you need to pick up bigger and better glyphs. So in order to cast the spell at the bottom here, I'm going to need 2 of the 7 glyphs, the oranges. So I would cast this one down here, and it's a botch called Alone. It's a level 4 because it's in that last grid, and of course it's going to have a bad effect on me in the game. The one we're looking for in this game is actually going to be right here. It's called Guardian. Guardian is going to allow you to place a golem into the room you're in, and that's the objective here, to have a golem in all of the 4 corner rooms of our board. Additionally, you'll see if you have the shield, once again, it gives you a better effect that you're able to go ahead and put a golem in a room adjacent to where you're at, so it gives you a little bit more control. So you're going to be trying to collect the glyphs on the board in order to cast these spells, learn what they do, and hopefully help you complete your objective without losing the game. So here you can see the main board for Wizards Academy. Now, you'll note that these tiles are randomized out here and that we're in a 4x4 grid. Each of these different tiles is a different room in the Academy. So for example, you have the Flux Point, or you have the Warded Room. Now, each of these rooms also has a special ability. Some of them may just be bonus icons that are printed on there that interact with spells. There's a diamond and a little swirly here. But for example, the Warded Room has an ability on it that says if you cast a botched spell, which are those red spells we talked about earlier, they have no effect in this room. So this is a good place to try out spells that you don't know by just discarding glyphs to cast them. Another room, which we did mention in brief earlier, is the library. This is where you can take the bind spells action, which will allow you to, from your memory of what you've already cast in the spell grid that we looked at earlier, try and point to a particular card, name that card, and lock it, which will flip it over and allow you to see what it is at all times. So, each of these rooms has a particular action that you can take. The most important room for the start of the game is going to be the Mana Crystal. This is a room where everybody starts, and it's also kind of a timer for the game. You'll see that we have some tokens here. These are mana tokens, and there are 6 of them. If we lose these 6 mana tokens, and there are several ways we can lose them, mostly by threats going into that room, but also if our wizards happen to be damaged or killed by a threat, the Mana Crystal will save them and will lose a mana in the game. If you lose all of your mana, you will lose the game. So, each of our players is going to start out in this Mana Crystal, and they're going to be trying to accomplish the objective for this scenario, which is to have a Guardian or a Golem. The spell is called Guardian, but they are referred to as Golems in the scenario. You can try and get one into each of these 4 rooms, either by getting them to move, which is difficult, or by casting the spell Guardian and placing them into these 4 rooms. And if you do that, you will win the game. So, how are you going to do this? Well, each player is going to get a specific turn in which that turn they're going to take several different actions in a particular order. Now, each player is, of course, representing their own wizard, and they have a tableau here. We'll see the one for Bramblethorn, which is one of the 2 characters out on our board right now. Bramblethorn is going to look like this. Of course, we've got a nice illustration of what he looks like, but furthermore, we'll see that he has an icon of the shield on his board. We saw some spells earlier that interact with this. If you have this shield, they're not quite as bad, or perhaps they're better than they would normally be if they were a good spell. In addition, each character will have a special ability. So this one says that you may cancel a botched spell cast in your room by you or someone else by playing glyphs equal to the level of the spell. And we saw that spells are level 1, 2, 3, or 4. So if you've picked up a bunch of glyphs, you may discard them to cancel the effect of a botched spell. Furthermore, you'll see they have an area for sharing glyphs. This makes the glyph on that space, and only one glyph available to all players on the board. And then they have a space for a wand, a staff, and a robe. And each of these items has a different ability. For example, wands will let you use the particular glyph used to make that wand as any glyph. Robes will protect you from a particular threat, and Staves are going to let you cast a combination of spell for free, so you can use that spell no matter what without having to discard the glyphs. So each player has one of these that they're going to use to keep track of their glyphs and use to keep track of which items they have so far in the game. On a player's turn, they're going to start out, and they're going to, of course, always have to play a disaster card. So, at the beginning of their turn, each player will always have one of these disaster cards, and the first thing they're going to do is flip this card over and resolve it. So, what this says right now is that we're going to activate threats. There are going to be a lot of these cards in the deck immediately, and they say activate all threats in the Holy Room, the Library, and the Lost Room. We would go and we would look at each of these rooms, and at the start of the game, there are no threats in these rooms. Lost Room is clear, Holy Room is clear, and the last room was going to be the Library, and that is also clear. So there's nothing in any of these rooms, but later we could have fire, we could have ice or water, perhaps we're going to have some imps in that room. Whatever it is, we would activate it appropriately, and we can talk about those in a little more detail, because they will be an important, threat to walking around the Academy. Other threats could be various different things. So it could be, for example, water. So this says water portals produce water. Well, we don't have any water portals right now, so they wouldn't produce water. But then it said if there are no threatening water portals in the Academy, select a random room and place a water portal in that room. So, if you don't have any water portals on the board, this will throw one out there. And so if you were to place this threat instead of the one that we had here, this disaster card instead of the one we played earlier, we would have to randomly place a portal out. So we have little portal tokens, and we would draw a random location, find out where we're going to place it. So this says we'd place it in the Master's Study. We would find the Master's Study out onto the board. We would put this here, and we would show that it's a water portal. The next time that this activated, we would go ahead and we would get water into this room. Now that we have water in the room, this is going to slow movement through this room. If it were fire, it could do damage to you at the end of the turn, and fire can eventually spread to go to more rooms. And of course, you want to avoid these going into the mana crystal, because if they do, they're going to deal damage to your mana crystal, and you'll lose one of your tokens, putting you closer to the end of the game. Water, if it goes even further, can flood and cause you to die if you get stuck in the room, or of course can spread out to other rooms and try and shut those down to make movement in the Academy slower. There are also more active threats like imps or goblins or demons that can happen to come out into this area. They would have their own particular portals out onto the board, and those will be things that if you get stuck in a room with them will deal damage to you or will shut down your ability to move like other threats, but they may kind of intelligently move through the Academy in order to try and damage you or to steal things from you, because imps take your glyphs away. So, once you have finished activating your disaster, you will draw a new disaster card, and that will give you information for your next turn. After you've resolved your disaster and drawn a new card, you're going to go ahead and take your main turn. Your main turn consists of 3 actions. Now in the basic game, you get any 3 actions you want, which are going to be moving, doing room actions, such as activating the ability of a room or picking up glyphs, or you can go ahead and do spell actions, which would be casting spells by discarding glyphs that you've picked up. And you need to have 2 glyphs to discard in order to activate something on the grid, because each card location is 2 different glyphs, be it the same glyph twice or 2 different glyphs in order to activate that spell. So on your turn, if you're in the advanced game, you get 3 actions, but they must be different types of actions. There are move actions, which are moving from one room to another. There are room actions, which are activating the room or the glyphs, and then there are spell actions, and you get 1 of each of these types of actions. Now, the slightly more interesting part is that different actions can be used as other types of actions. So a move action in the advanced game is always a move action. It can't be a room or a spell action. But for example, a room action can be anything room action or lesser, which could be a room or a move action. And a spell action, which is the most powerful type of action, can be a spell, room, or move action. So you could, in theory, take 3 move actions if you didn't want to take a room or a spell action. So let's say that it's our first player's turn and they're playing as Bramblethorn, and they decide on their turn that they're going to move with their move action over to the flux point. So they've now used their move action. Now there's nothing they really want to do in the flux point, so they decide that they'd like to move through the doors here into the scrying chamber. So they're using one of their other actions as a move. In this case, let's call it their spell action. So they're using their best action as a move because they won't have enough glyphs to cast a spell on their turn. As their third action, they're going to do a room action, and they're going to pick up a glyph of the type that's available in that room. Now when they're done with this, they can place this onto their board, and they can either place it into their general area, or they can place it onto their shared area, which would mean it's available to all of the players, but you can only ever have one glyph on this shared area, and when you're casting a spell, you may only use one glyph from a shared area to cast a spell, be it your or your partner's shared area. So, he picks one of these up and he places it on his board, and that is the end of his turn. If there were any effects in his room, be it fire or water, he would have to endure the problem of those threats. So it could be an imp, which would steal a glyph from him at the end of the turn. Or it could be some fire, which would burn him and cause you to lose a mana crystal and potentially allow him to teleport back to the mana crystal area. Whatever it might be, if there was anything there, he'd have to deal with those effects. Now that he's done, we would go on to the next player's turn, and that player would then activate their own disaster card. So it would say if there are any threats that happen to be in the outer dimension, the mana crystal, or in the laboratory, you would activate those. But again, we don't have any, so that's not going to happen. Now this is the first we've heard of the outer dimension, which is a room that's sitting outside of our academy. You'll see that one of the glyphs that we need to be collecting, actually the highest level glyph, happens to be positioned here. You can't access this at the beginning of the game, but in our spell grid there is a teleport spell, which will allow you to teleport to a room that's in the academy, and there's also a break dimension spell that will allow you to swap any two rooms in the game, their position, so you can move this into the academy and have access to that glyph. So you'll need to find a way to do this because the spell we need to win the game is definitely in a group that's going to require at least one of these glyphs to cast. So you must find a way to do that. Now this player doesn't have a lot they can do. They can, for example, move and move again just like our previous player. And now they have a choice if they'd like to use their room action to either activate this room, which wouldn't help them at all, pick up this glyph, or perhaps move into another room, but that would waste their third action. Now that they're done with this, they would again pass the turn to the first player, who would have another disaster card and would play that card. So again, it's going to be activating threats in some rooms, and nothing happens. And you'll see that this is very common in the early game, but later on you will have threats that are going to be causing problems with your movement around the academy. Now that Bramblethorn has done his disaster again, he gets his 3 actions, and this time his actions are going to be to move into the laboratory. He is going to pick up another glyph, so he's going to pick up the 3rd level glyph here. He will again add it to his board, so now he has 2 glyphs, one not shared and one shared. And his 3rd action is going to be to cast a spell. He would cast a spell by discarding any 2 glyphs. In this case, it's going to be blue, and it's going to be white, or kind of, I guess, tan here. So 1 and 3 is really what they are. When he does this, he's going to reference the spell grid we saw earlier, and he's going to flip over the appropriate spell. So this is the spell from 3-1 on my grid. When I flip it over, I see that the spell is called Blast. This spell lets me do 2 damage to a target in my own room, or 1 damage to a target in an adjacent room. And if I had this little fire symbol, either on the room, which happens to be in the flux point, or on my own character, which I don't, I would actually get to destroy all ice counters in the target room. Well, there's no ice there anyway, so no big deal. However, there is something for me to target in an adjacent room. There's a golem here, and it's guarding a glyph. These golems aren't really threats. They're just things you're going to need to deal with, or guardians, that you're going to need to deal with in order to get to the glyphs that are in that room, because you cannot pick them up while there's a guardian there. Each threat in the game, at least in terms of guardians and imps that you'll see in the basic game, are going to take 1 point of damage to kill. So if we want to get rid of this guardian, we're going to deal 1 point of damage to it. It will be destroyed, and now we have access to the green glyph, which will allow us to cast more spells from our spell grid. Once I'm done casting this, it's going to flip back face down and go on the grid. But you're going to want to remember where it's at, because flipping them over, or locking them permanently, will allow you to see what they are when you try and cast them. And this is an important aspect to knowing what you're doing throughout the game and avoiding casting botched spells. So now that player is again done with their turn and would pass on to the next player, who would continue up this cycle of drawing a disaster card, resolving that disaster card. Technically have drawn their card on the last turn, but they would resolve their disaster card and draw a new one, and then take their actions. Maybe they'd start working over to the library so they could bind spells, again playing kind of the memory aspect of the grid, trying to either guess or knowing what spells are out there and pointing to them in order to lock them, flip them over permanently. Now this can be a little bit risky, particularly if you're guessing, because if you guess wrong, you lose a mana crystal, so you don't want to do that too frequently if you don't know what spells are in particular regions on the grid. Furthermore, you must do it with a little bit of haste, because some of these cards will reorganize the unlocked or face down cards in the grid, so that you need to get to them before they get rearranged so that you know where they're at. Again, very memory-like aspect of this game. You may also, as a reminder, lose mana crystals if you're killed by something that happens to be in a room, threat such as fire or water, or if any of those threats manage to work their way into the mana crystal. You can also use mana crystals to teleport you back to that area so that you can start over fresh instead of having to walk back. But of course, you don't want to run out or you will lose the game. The other way you can lose the game is if you run out of disaster cards to add to your deck. So as you cycle through this deck, eventually it will run out, and when it does, you're going to add the top 2 cards from this progression deck into the deck and reshuffle. These will make the threats that are coming out worse, or will give them new special effects to add. So this one says draw 2 random locations, select one, and move all players to that location. Not so bad. But the other one says move all imps, trolls, demons, and players 1 space towards the mana crystal, ignoring obstacles that slow but do not prevent movement. So this is going to bring all of your threats closer to the mana crystal and will potentially damage it. So, of course, you don't want these to get in here, and if all of these cards run out, the game will end and you will lose. In order to win, at least in this scenario, you must find the spell that happens to be at 7 6 glyphs. So you would need a 6 glyph, which is in the Lost Room, currently inaccessible, and the 7 glyph, which is in the Outer Dimension, in order to find the hidden Guardian spell, allowing you to cast Guardians in all 4 corners. And if you successfully do this before you run out of mana crystals, or before you run out of the progression deck, you will win the game of Wizards Academy. And there you have it. That is Wizards Academy, a cooperative game up on Kickstarter now and looking for your support. Now this is a game that's going to be difficult, and as with all cooperative games, it should be. Now this one incorporates something that's a little bit different. It does have that memory aspect in it. And that card grid, while central to gameplay, is not necessarily all about memory. It is, of course, going to be important to remember what you have cast out on that grid if they go back face down in the unlocked position. But the real issue is finding the spells that you need in order to win the scenario that you're in. That scenario could be casting golems in the 4 corners of the rooms. And so you need to find the card to cast Guardian, which will let you put the golems in there. Now, of course, there's a small memory aspect to that, but the more important issue is not remembering, but figuring out when the appropriate time is to go and bind spells, and how to balance that with all of the other things you need to do in the game, be it picking up glyphs in order to cast more spells, or be it controlling the different threats that are happening throughout the university. Could be imps, could be water, could be fire, whatever it is, you need to protect the mana crystal, and so there's kind of a balance to be done there. Do you kind of work the memory aspect of the game, quickly find a lot of spells, go and bind them, or do you take your chances, not bind them, and potentially have them shuffled, but take care of other things in the game? The scenarios are going to change from game to game. The layout of your academy will change from game to game. Of course, the way that cards come up will change from game to game, and the spell organization and the spell grid will change from game to game. So there's going to be a lot of variety that's available to you in this. On top of that, there are different difficulties from easy to hard that can change each scenario to make them more difficult or easier correspondingly if you need to have that kind of stepping stone in order to learn the game, learn its different facets, and kind of build up in order to keep the game fresh. So if that sounds good to you, go ahead and check it out on Kickstarter. They're up now, and I'm sure they'd be happy to have your support.
Thanks for watching our review today. For more information about board games, as well as the #1 board game audio podcast, check out Dicetower.com for reviews, interviews, and more. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.
Yeah?